Okay, thanks for the invitation and for the interesting times that we've been having here. I have this choice to make that I can either see my notes or you. I'm not quite sure what to do about that. But in fact, so what I'm going to do is to address the issue of how can logic, in the sense that I believe that the later Wittgenstein is engaged or says that he's engaged in a logical investigation, how can his later investigations be understood as something non-empirical? Because it's also very clear that, however language is used, however we use these expressions like pain or whatever, that's an empirical matter of fact. So there's no such account as you would find in, let's say, Frege or the early Wittgenstein, that any possible thinker somehow have to have, these be engaged in these forms of thought. I don't think we can say that the possibility of thought requires us to use, various kinds of expressions that we actually do, including expressing pain. I mean, that's an interesting question in itself, whether how the fact that we're certain kind of bodily beings comes into how we think. But okay, so that's a further issue. So that's what I want to talk about, how the later Wittgenstein's descriptions of language can be understood as non-empirical, so that what he does can be understood as logic, as he claims it to be. Given that those forms of language and thought that are being investigated or targeted in investigations are, as he also is clear, are empirical phenomena. So that's what I want to talk about, and this is in some ways summarizing some bits from my the recent book that was mentioned, Wittgenstein and Logic as Method of Philosophy. So there's a kind of maybe I'm trying to summarize some bits of 3 chapters to you. So these issues are discussed in much more detail in the actual thing. But now I sound too much like some sort of salesman again for my taste. So I'm just saying that as a reference. And so how does this problem arise for Wittgenstein? Well, I think that so the Tractatus did have an account of the non-empirical or a priori status of logic. And that account was basically that, whatever is logically necessary for language or any particular expressions is what is common to all the things that can say the same thing. So that gives you then an account of what logic is concerned with, namely with whatever is common to all those expressions that can express a certain sense, or whatever is common to language altogether. And that's, of course, the story of the Tractatus about the general propositional form and so on. But this account is no longer available to the later Wittgenstein. So he actually has to come up with a different kind of account. And I do believe that the account is continuous with the Tractatus, continues with certain ideas in the Tractatus, namely that a notation is the proper way to express exception as necessity. So that's the same idea that is developed in a different way in the later Wittgenstein. So there is definitely a continuity there, but also very important difference, because Wittgenstein thinks that in the Tractatus he was kind of led into making a dogmatic claim about the essence of language. So this idea that, whatever a priori bit or what is logically necessary, something common to all those things, that led him to make a simplistic claim about the nature of language. And of course, this is well known. Later he says that logicians, should make themselves aware about how much more complicated language is in comparison to what the author of the Tractatus said. There's a bunch of well-known remarks to that that make that sort of point. But so, if we then acknowledge or recognize the complexity of language, how do we deal with, how do we explain the non-empirical character of logic? So that is the issue. And so if you look at the handout, okay, so the first bit is just a very quick characterization of how the Tractatus, in slightly different words than what I just gave how the Tractatus thinks of the a priori status of logic. I mean, logic, the principles of logic are something that is always already assumed in thinking and speaking. That's the sense in which logic is a priori. That's the Tractatus. Okay. But also the later Wittgenstein says, well, we can't, this would be Investigations 81, we can't say that anybody who's using language must be playing a certain kind of calculus. So this account of the a priori status of logic that the Tractatus has is no longer available for him, because it would involve this kind of what he would later consider a dogmatic claim that anybody who's able to think must be operating a certain kind of calculus, such as the Tractatus calculus. So that the answer is not available. He needs to give another account, unless we're just going to say, yeah, that's just armchair anthropology. But that would be then that would be, you know, then the philosophical relevance of the later Wittgenstein would be completely unclear. Who cares about, you know, armchair anthropology? It has no philosophical relevance. These empirical points about, you know, language is used in this and that way, and you know, and I think that these are kind of also Russell's kind of doubts about the later Wittgenstein. Oh, he's come up with this new way of thinking that is completely uninteresting, idle tea table amusement, basically. You know, all these funny things about language. Well, look how we use that expression. So what's that got to do with logic? I think is Russell's concern. He talks about this in his autobiography. He can't understand it as logic. Anyway, so if you look at the quotations number 1 and 2 in the handout, so until the very early 30s, Wittgenstein held this view that is, I take also to be characteristic of the Tractatus, that logic just has nothing to do with anything human. Nothing to do with anything specifically, you know, empirical about the kinds of creatures that we are. So he says, but the natural history of the use of a word can't be of any concern to logic. Well, if you look around how we use pain, that's a bit of human natural history there. So that can't be any concern to logic. I think that what the later Wittgenstein does is he makes this available to logic. Through this explanation. Quotation number 2, what makes a thought for us can't be anything human, something that had to do with the constitution and nature of humans, but something purely logical that obtains independently of the natural history of a human being. So I take it that that's again, he's referring to the idea that, well, whatever this logic is concerned with would be something that is common to every possible thinker, you know, whatever they do when they think. That's what logic is concerned with. But that's the old Tractarian account, still here in the early 30s. And this is something that Wittgenstein overcomes and arrives at what I think can be really described as properly naturalistic logic. That it is both non-empirical investigation, but it is an investigation of something that is really, you know, part of the natural history of humans, and so natural in that sense. And so here is just the number 3, quotation number 3 is just the acknowledgement to make sure that we're all on the same page about however language functions. That is an empirical matter of fact. And that's what Wittgenstein says. I always wanted to say against Ramsey, logic can't become an empirical science, but how we use words is certainly an empirical matter. So how do we kind of square this circle is the issue here. And the same problem arises for, so the Tractatus thought that logic has to be simple so that there can be no surprises in logic. So that's why logic has to be simple. We need to be able to have a perfect kind of overview of the possible forms of language, and that's the idea of the general propositional form there and so on. So this gives us that very simple thing that sort of gives us an overview of all of language or all possible forms of thought. And logic was also supposed to be simple and exact in the Tractatus. And of course, simplicity and exactness are still, and the later Wittgenstein still acknowledges them as important ideals of logic. Because simple is something that we can understand clearly. And exact is, of course, something, what is complicated is hard to understand. That's why we simplify logic. And that's why Wittgenstein tries to bring, I take it that in Tractatus he kind of hops on board of the Russellian and Fregean project of clarifying the principles that govern thinking that aims at truth, to speak in Frege's terms. And what that culminates in the Tractatus is the account of the general form of proposition. So there is, everything is contained in this single logical constant, which is the general propositional form. So, wow, that's quite an impressive sort of way of thinking, it seems to me, to bring everything, all those principles that govern thinking, into this one variable. But that is the Tractatus achievement, I think. It's quite interesting. But nevertheless, so the importance of simplicity is here, so that you can have a complete overview of the possible forms of thought. And that's what, logic gives you the standard of clarity. It's not, something, a little less. But so how then, if logic gives you the standard of clarity, how can we achieve this in the situation where the later Wittgenstein acknowledges, well, language is a pretty complicated and messy thing. So how can we now achieve that sort of clarity? And also, so simplicity and exactness are still ideals that I don't think that he gives up later either. But the part of the task then is to explain how can you simplify without falsifying? Or you could also say, how is logical idealization possible? Because if you falsify, then you're not idealizing, you're falsifying. And so why am I saying all these things together? How to explain the non-empirical character of statements of logic that we make when we try to clarify language use or our concepts or whatever. So the non-empirical character, the possibility of simplification, a possibility of exactness when your target of investigation is not functioning according to any exact rules, it's not simple but complex, it's also dynamic, constantly fluctuating, but nevertheless you're going to have to use some sort of static models to describe it. So how can you do that without falsifying your target of investigation? That I think is the, maybe I'll go as far as to claim, maybe just for the provocation, the problem that later Wittgenstein is dealing with. Anyway, definitely one of the central problems that he has. And the investigations gives a solution to this. The solution, of course, is contained in quotation number 5. So I can finish this here. You just read number 5, and we're done. Well, what goes on in number 5? That is a pretty opaque remark. However, it's here quoted in my notes on top of the section called the solution. Anyway, I've given you the problem, now here comes the solution. So Wittgenstein writes, we see that what we call sentence and language has not the formal unity that I imagined, but is the family of structures more or less related to one another. So that means language is a kind of family of different kinds of uses. There is not the formal unity that the Tractatus assumed, namely, expressed in the in terms of the general propositional form, the only logical constant that there is. So there isn't that unity. Okay, that unity was also the one that put him earlier, he thought, in a position to say, well, what he's doing, what he's talking about is nothing empirical about language, but something that is essential to every possible language, that common thing. But so, now we Now we lost that common thing. So what do we do now? But what becomes of logic now is what he asked. Its rigor seems to be giving way here. How does logic, the rigor of logic, how is that giving way here? Well, for instance, we don't have any sort of clear demarcation now, when there's not that formal unity captured in the notion of general propositional form. So we can't demarcate what counts as language and what does not count as language. So for instance, that bit is lost. Also, simplicity and clarity. So the Tractatus had this idea that there are these simple and exact rules underlying the surface of language. So we clarify language in those terms. Oh yeah, it looks like we're latching onto something, we're giving something really rigorous, exact and simple. I mean, the notion of rigor itself is complicated, so I'm not going to pretend to be able to explain to you in all kinds of ways what rigor is. But rigor is connected with kind of ideas about that we really know what we're doing. When we take this step, we know that we're taking this step and not some other step. So it is essentially connected somehow with clarity in logic. Mathematics is supposed to be a rigorous discipline. Why? Well, I guess because we're supposed to know exactly what's going on there when we take our steps. It's not kind of opaque operation like human life is. I'm going to now rigorously pursue my friendships. I mean, yeah, I don't know what that means. So it's not really a human thing of human life. Anyway, so rigor seems to be giving way, but in that case, doesn't logic altogether disappear? For how can it lose its rigor? Well, logic can't. If logic sets the standard of rigor and clarity, then you can't bargain any of it away, because then you lost logic. So if rigor is essential to logic, you can't bargain any of it away. So the standards are really set quite high, but we're dealing with Wittgenstein, so no surprise there. Okay, so how can logic lose its rigor? Of course not by bargaining any of its rigor out of it. The preconceived idea of crystalline purity can only be removed by turning our whole examination around. One might say, the axis of reference of our examination must be rotated, but about the fixed point of our real need. There is the solution. This turning around of the examination. Or the crystalline system. So what Wittgenstein refers to here as the crystalline system or crystalline rules is that system that the Tractatus postulated as underlying language use. Those exact and precise rules that govern a language that logical analysis would reveal. That's the crystalline system. But the Tractatus kind of, you might say from the point of view of the later Wittgenstein, kind of reified these ideals. It tried to satisfy the ideals of logic of exactness, simplicity and rigor and so on by postulating something like that as underlying the actual languages as part of actual reality. So he speaks in the investigations about our misunderstanding the notion of ideal. So the Tractatus postulated something ideal, these precise and exact rules, and tried to satisfy those ideals of logic of rigor and simplicity and exactness in that way by postulating the structure underlying language. But now, this solution becomes problematic to Wittgenstein. He thinks this is 102 of the investigations. This involves a misunderstanding of the notion of ideal. So what does it mean to turn around the investigation? Well, Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein speaks of recognizing our model. We have a model, we present some sort of a model in logic, I mean, he did in the Tractatus, except that he did not recognize this model, this calculus that the Tractatus puts forward. He did not, by his own admission, he did not recognize it for what it is, namely a model put forward by some logician guy in order that we then use that model of language. Language as a certain kind of calculus to clarify the uses of language. So he thought that he was, and this is what the investigations talks about in several remarks, like that we, see in reality what is really part of our mode of representation. 104 and 114 talks about those things in the investigations. So we project onto the object of investigation something that is really kind of there on our glasses. Well, what are those glasses? Well, they are the logical glasses of the Tractatus calculus. We look at language through that by comparing it with that sort of calculus. And then we think that we find that structure there, right there in reality. And that's the kind of confusion that the Tractatus, according to the later Wittgenstein, kind of fell into. That we think that what is really part of our mode of representation, we project the features of our mode of representation onto reality. And this includes, for instance, the idea that language has to work according to these simple and exact rules. That's part of the mode of how the logician is presenting language, because the calculus really functions. That's the mode of representing language in the Tractatus. The calculus really functions according to those clear and precise rules. But rather than recognizing that as a model, Wittgenstein thought that that's really there in reality. Well, but that's the confusion about idealization that I already mentioned. So there is one line of thought, I believe, that explains all these things that so how to explain logical exceptionless necessity, simplicity, the possibility of simplicity, exactness in logic when the target of investigation is not like that. And this is explained in terms of the idea of turning the investigation around. Namely, what does that mean? We have to recognize that point about language functioning according to simple rules, which may be important because, like I said, simple is something that you can understand clearly, and exact is something where you know exactly how it works, sort of tautologically. Those are features now to be recognized as the features of our model. It is characteristic, for instance, of the Tractarian calculus that it functions according to these simple and exact rules. That's not to be confused with the features of the target of investigation. Rather, it is our mode of representing language that has these features of simplicity, exactness, and so on. And similarly, it is exceptionless necessity is a feature of our mode of representing language, those modes of representing language that we use when we try to clarify it. Meaning, you can put it in this way, I state a grammatical rule, let's say meaning is use. That doesn't say, oh, sometimes meaning is used. It says meaning is used. It is a non-temporal statement in the sense that the later Wittgenstein talks about non-temporal statements, which means it does not refer to any particular occasion of, for instance, meaningful language use in reality. It doesn't refer to anything in reality. That's how he defines the notion of non-temporality. So temporal statement is, for instance, this statement about that there's a chair here. So it refers to this, that this is a particular statement. Refers to a specific, place and time. Or that in the last year the University of Bergen has been full of chairs. That's a general temporal statement. But when you say something like meaning is used, if that's a grammatical rule, that's a non-temporal statement. So it doesn't refer to any specific occasion of language use. It just gives you this principle, meaning is used. Or every proposition is a picture. That's if you look at it from the light of the point of view of the later Wittgenstein, that's a non-temporal statement that doesn't say anything about any specific proposition. It just says this is what propositions are like. And so, or we could put this in a way that brings out the necessity clearly. In order for something to be a proposition, it has to be a picture. Well, there's a necessary statement. The Tractate is confused that with the statement about reality, that every proposition really is a picture. But the necessity that gets expressed here is a feature of the model. So it is characteristic of this kind of logical models that they say something that is exceptionless. Okay, so there is the model. So first step, we need to recognize the model for what it is, that we are actually developing these kinds of things. When we make statements of grammatical rules, those are our instruments of clarification. So I haven't come to the part yet what we do with those things. But those are the kinds of animals that we're dealing with. You know, we're making, logicians are making this kind of exceptionless statements. And those statements are not, I think this is really important for the later Wittgenstein, those statements are not statements about some weird non-temporal entities, such as the essence of propositions that is somehow there in language, in actual reality. No, this statement that every proposition is a picture is a mode of representing language. And then, well, does language fit that or not? Well, then we come to the idea of using these models, as Wittgenstein says in the investigations 130 and 131, of using those models as objects of comparison. And so if you look at the handout again, 6 and 7, I'll come back to the little 6, 7, 8, I guess, would be relevant. Games of languages which we make up with stated rules, so these are the simple language games, serve one purpose: to make comparisons. They can be put besides actual language use so as to enable us to see certain features of them, and by this means to get rid of certain difficulties. Or the investigations. Our clear and simple language games are not preliminary studies for the future regimentation of language, as it were first approximations ignoring friction and air resistance. Rather, the language games stand there as objects of comparison, which through similarities and dissimilarities are meant to throw light on the features of language. So we are to compare the actual messy, complicated language use with these simpler models, with the purpose of capturing and clarifying specific aspects of the actual language use. So here was, so we know, and you could use, the later Wittgenstein allows for the possibility that we could continue making use of the Tractarian calculus for clarificatory purposes. He doesn't reject it. Some interpreters say that he simply rejects the idea of language as a calculus. No, it stays in the kind of tool pack. That kind of calculus conception of language can do some clarificatory work. Wittgenstein is explicit about that it can clarify part of the function of logical connectives and so on. We can do some work with that whenever that's all we need. Obviously, you can't use the Tractarian model of language to say anything about poetic language use. It just doesn't apply to that kind of situation. But if we are focusing on uses of language, well, we're just concerned with true or false assertions. Yeah, maybe, that model gets us somewhere, it can be good enough for some specific purposes. But now we come to the another important idea, that these clarifications are always relative to specific problems. There's no such thing as clarifying language use as such, but those clarifications are always in response or relative to specific problems. Why? Because it depends on those problems what needs to be said about the target of clarification. When has our problem been clarified? When has enough been said about, this and that concept? Well, when the problems that we were dealing with have been solved. So those problems give you the criterion of completeness for the clarification. And that's quite important too. And so in that sense, given specific problems, the Tractarian model might give us all we need, and it might be okay for that purpose. Or if we're concerned with features of language use that model can't handle, if we have, other kinds of problems, or, the Tractarian calculus can't tell you anything about the concept of freedom. We need different methods to clarify, the notion of freedom, the concept of freedom, and, freedom of the will. And this is, of course, something that Wittgenstein discusses in his lecture on the freedom of the will, and he uses language games there as his method. He's got these weird examples, but if you look at those examples in light of the method of language games, it kind of falls into place. He's got these weird examples of somebody controlling him with a joystick, basically, upstairs, and those kinds of weird simple language games there that are meant to bring into focus specific aspects of the concept of freedom. Can't really do that with the Tractarian calculus. But this is also another thing that later Wittgenstein emphasizes. In order to address a philosophical problem, you don't only need, this is I think a quotation from Remarks on Color, you don't only need to figure out what to say about the issue, but also which methods to use. So your methods need to be chosen so that they actually can address your problems and those specific cases that you try to deal with. And so the calculus, that's all right if you're dealing with mathematics and geometry and so on. Logical calculus, I don't see much reason to complain. Why do they work there? Well, because the target of investigation itself also functions according to these clear and simple rules. Then I guess it's, also you can clarify it by that with the help of that sort of system. But then if you've got something more fluctuating going on, well, maybe then the calculus doesn't really work very well in that context. But if you now turn back to page 1 of the handout, there's this little bit there after quotation number 5, which I have not numbered because it's not a quotation from Wittgenstein. It's my little summary about idealization. A simple way to explain the key idea of Wittgenstein's account of idealization. So there's a difference between making the kind of claim that Tractatus made, that language is used according to simple and exact rules. If it isn't, that's false. The claim is false. And I guess the Tractatus was wrong in making that claim about actual language. However, it's a completely different thing to say for certain purposes, for specific purposes of clarification, we can regard language as being used according to such and such precise and simple rules. That's not now a falsification insofar as what we say about the target of investigation is what we need to say in order to deal with our problems. If our problems, if those simple rules by means of which we now represent language use, if those simple rules are what does the job of clarification so that we can deal with our problems to get those problems solved, then that's fine. Everything that we need has been accounted for in order to solve those specific problems. So there's no falsification, and here is the possibility of idealizing without falsifying. You're not falsifying as long as you say everything that is relevant for solving the problem. Then you got everything covered. Language has millions and millions of features. We can't account for them all anyway. And what's part of it? Is it relevant that the speaker is using certain kinds of socks? Could be relevant for some sort of linguistic act. You're wondering about what the guy is saying, then you look at his socks and he's got swastikas in his socks, and suddenly you realize what he's all about, what sort of linguistic action he's engaged in. But that means almost anything can be relevant. But the important point for not falsifying is that your clarification captures whatever is relevant for dealing with those issues that you're trying to deal with. So that's the idea of idealization, and so you can say we can simplify, we can represent language as being used according to simpler rules than it actually is, insofar as the clarifications in terms of those uses capture whatever we need to capture in order to clarify the issues. So there's the possibility of idealizing and simplifying without falsifying. And the same for exactness. So you can describe language as being used according to exact rules, as long as that's what you need for the purposes of clarification. So there's a kind of idealization about exactness there. So here we then have an account of how these ideals of logic, of simplicity and exactness and so on, can still be satisfied. The important thing is that we now recognize, those simple things, simple rules, exact rules, that they are part of our mode of representing language. We don't make claims or put forward theses about language actually being used according to simple and exact rules. That's the Tractatus, and Wittgenstein went wrong there, he thinks later. So we avoid the Tractatus mistake in that sort of way. And so on the second page I've got some quotations about language games, but I'm not sure if I'll really go into them. What I think might be a good thing to talk about is, because we're dealing with the problem of, so in what sense is the later Wittgenstein not making empirical claims about language? And the idea is, okay, so he's, develops these models. Those models are expressions of necessity, like meaning is use. According to that model, meaning is nothing but use. Or we can specify meaning as rule-governed use. I don't think that the later Wittgenstein makes a claim that language is always used according to rules. But it is certainly one of the models that he proposes, that sometimes, we can helpfully look at language as rule-governed activity. And in that way, then clarify language by stating rules for its use. But those rules are the model or the instrument that we use to clarify language. So, when I say language is used according to such and such a rule, that's not to be understood as a claim about actual language use. That it is used according to such and such rule is a feature of one model. And if I describe language as being used according to a certain rule, well then there is the expression of necessity. That it functions like this. The rule states a necessity there, or a possibility. So it's not stating anything about any actuality. And then I use that rule and compare the actual cases with it. And hopefully can say something helpful about those actual uses with the help of this simplified model. And when I do that, I'm not making empirical statements about language. And so here we come to my final point. In what way am I not making an empirical claims about language? Is not my description correct if it somehow corresponds to actual language use? That's a tempting picture, but that's the wrong picture. That's the wrong picture about what the correctness of a clarification, logical clarification, consists in. It's not correspondence with actual language use. And this comes out if you think about how these kind of grammatical clarifications are justified. And also, the difference from empirical statements comes out if you think about what the generality of these kinds of grammatical clarifications is. Well, how are those kinds of clarifications in terms of grammatical rules, for instance, or simple language games, how are they justified? Well, their justification depends on the clarification or the philosophical work that they can do. So if your clarification can solve philosophical problems, then it is justified. Now, an example, look at the last quotation from Investigation 244. So there Wittgenstein, and so here we come also to the naturalism issue, because so how is this naturalistic? Well, here is what I would call, or propose to call in the book where I'm sort of giving you bits, I would propose to call this a natural historical picture. So, how does a human being learn the meaning of the names of sensations, of the word pain, for example? Here is one possibility. Words are connected with the primitive, the natural expressions of the sensations and used in their place. A child has hurt himself and he cries, and then the adults talk to him and teaching explanations, later sentences, they teach the child a new pain behavior. So here's a model, kind of picked out of natural history of humans. If Wittgenstein was making an empirical claim here, he would certainly have to give some evidence that this is how kids actually used to learn those expressions, but that's not at all what's going on. He's completely unconcerned to give any sort of empirical evidence for this claim. The issue just doesn't come up. Well, then, if not with reference to how it corresponds to actual language use, namely that this is really how children learn to use language, well, how is this model justified? Well, this model gives you an account of, so contrast this with the traditional account of what it is to talk about the inner, namely that we have these states and then we refer to them. As you well know, Wittgenstein raises a problem about this. If you think about, talk about your inner states on that model, then we'll end up with the problem of private language, and we can't even know our own mental states, because there's no criterion of correctness for those private names. So we can't understand, talk about our own sensations or how it all starts on that model, because then anything will be right and nothing will be right. If instead you employ this picture here, that talk about inner states is essentially connected with natural expressions, so the kid, we are beings who have the capacity to feel pain. When we do, we behave in certain kind of ways that are very generally part of the natural history of humans. Ow! All that stuff, that's natural history there. So when we connect the talk about inner with these natural expressions, well, suddenly the inner is no longer hidden. You can see my pain or my depression or whatever on my face. Inner is not simply there hidden anymore in the back of my head, to which I would have to refer to with these private names and try to somehow capture them. No. The inner has now been brought forward with by connecting it with these natural expressions. That, I take it, is part of the work that this model in 244 is supposed to be doing. And this shows you what the justification of these kinds of clarification consists in. Namely, the philosophical, like I said, the philosophical work that it can do. Can this model help to solve the problem of other minds? Yeah, I think it can. Because now my inner states are no longer that hidden thing that you can never know anything about. Of course, there's still a possibility of me fooling you and feigning my pain and blah, 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 but that's just part of the language game. Its complex forms, not the primitive forms. We start from where there is no pretension. Pretension is then another layer that, the actual language game is complicated. It's multiple layers, Deception comes in later. Of course, babies learn that pretty quick. I mean, they start crying when they're bored. And the parents run, oh no, what's going on with the baby? And it was just, I was bored, So deception comes in pretty quickly, even before they start talking, but all this kind of, using that thing for a further purpose comes in quickly. But anyway, that's a side issue. What I wanted to illustrate is what sort of thing the justification of this clarification is. It depends on the philosophical work that the model can do. And so I think that this little bit here, this natural historical picture, we use it as a model. It gives you a certain idea of the function of pain expressions, namely that there is such a thing as manifesting or expressing your pain. That's the important idea. With that notion, we can kind of pull the inner, and it comes here like a part of the outer. The face is the best, or the eyes are the whatever, the window into the soul, and all that stuff now becomes available to us. And you can see my pain, and you can see my amusement on my face, and so on. Now I can see your perplexity. And your skepticism too. Yeah. Nothing is hidden. Anyway, so that's the justification. So this is a long way to say justification does not consist in correspondence with actual language use. It is a conceptual issue that we get these conceptual questions sorted out, such as created by the anomaly of the problem of other minds, that somehow everybody wants to say, yeah, we do know that, what's going on with other people, but the philosophical idea that it is about, naming your sensations and then it's inaccessible to everybody else, that model prevents us from admitting what we would like to admit, that yes, we can know other people's pain. Now we switch, and I think that's what Wittgenstein is partly suggesting. Of course, there's lots of things going on, but he's saying, hey, let's forget about that model. That doesn't work in this case. Let's use this other model of the manifestation and expression of pain, and that will help you to deal with these issues. So we can sort of pull the pain out, and here it is on my face. So that's a rambling account of what justification is. Now generality. So clearly that's then the point is clearly that's different from how you would justify an empirical statement about language use. You would have to go and look, is this actually what's going on in language use, and maybe do a lot of studies and so on. That would be an empirical justification. The justification here is kind of, you could say, conceptual. How does this model help to clarify conceptual relations, and so how does it help to solve our philosophical problems? If it does help to solve those philosophical problems, then it's a good model. And we could even say it's a correct model. Don't see a problem with that. Correctness in the sense in which I think the later Wittgenstein still assumes account of truth or correctness that he assumes in the Tractatus, that an account of logic is correct, he says in the Tractatus, when everything adds up in our symbolism. From the later point of view, you could say, well, the account is correct when things add up, so that we don't run against problems such as the problem of other minds. That's an anomaly that says there's something wrong with how you try to account for these uses of language, of talk about the inner. The anomaly there, the problem of other minds screams, there is an issue here. And you get rid of that issue if you substitute this other model for that, the kind of expressive or manifestative model. And then you kind of get a new start, and you can start building further points onto that. Okay, so I hope that the justification is clearly enough differentiated from empirical justification. This is part of then the reasons for saying, yeah, Wittgenstein is actually doing something that is not an empirical investigation of language. Because the justification of what he says is not like the justification of empirical statements about language use. Generality. Empirical statements are generalized in a particular way. You need to go and find further evidence for them. How are these logical clarificatory statements just generalized? Well, so think about this manifestation or expression model of pain. So there's this idea that you kind of express your pain, and that's one primitive way of talking about it. That's kind of the basis. And then, of course, further uses of language will come on top of that. When you learn to express your pain, then you can move from there to also to describing it. I mean, when you go to the doctor, obviously you're not expressing your pain unless you're really hurting. But for instance, if you talk about your pain yesterday to the doctor, I had this terrible pain there. Obviously, you're not expressing it. You have to be able to describe it. But the learning to manifest it with these words gives you the resources that you can then go and apply, make further uses of those same expressions. And then we get into this very rich picture of how we speak about the inner, because Wittgenstein then brings all kinds of other things to, like secondary senses. Everything seems unreal and those kinds of things. As a description of he says that this is something that people often say just before they go mad. I'm just performing. Don't worry. Everything is unreal. That's a secondary sense, in the sense that to speak about whether something is real or not, that's not originally used to describe your mental state. So I'm taking an expression and making further use of it in order to talk about my inner. Anyway, that's a bit of a side issue here. Generalization. Well, can I generalize this, let's say, manifestative model onto, let's say, other expressions of sensations? Well, something like this happens. Sometimes expressions of love, for instance, just come out of you, just like your expression of pain. At the moment of passion, you think, I love it. It just comes out, and you can't do it. It's like, ow! Now, that's a generalization there. I just generalized the pain model onto another expression of sensation. That generalization is legitimate insofar as the new model then works in that new situation. Namely, it has to be then justified in exactly the same way as I explained to you before, how the original model is justified in the original context of talking about pain and so on. So if it works, if this model works also in the case of expressions of other sensations, love is not really a sensation. It's not just a feeling. More than a feeling. Yeah. Anyway, I trust that you get the idea that you can apply the model to a further case, and its justification then will depend on, again, what philosophical work it can do in that context. If it can really render this love or whatever other sensations comprehensive. So then it's justified. And again, so the justification again is not like going and looking at these cases of love, finding empirical evidence. Do they really work like this case of expressing pain? That's not the justification. It's again, the justification works in this, let's say, conceptual front. If that model there can solve issues for you, you're okay to stretch the model or use it in those cases. So there, I think I forgot to. I get carried away and I forget my notes, but I think maybe this was fair enough. Go at what I wanted to say. So basically, here is the explanation of how Wittgenstein in the later philosophy can call himself a logician, in the sense that logic is a non-empirical discipline. He's giving something that you could properly describe as logical clarifications. They are not armchair anthropology or empirical statements about language use. We're doing something different. We're employing these models, characteristic of which is, for instance, the exceptionless necessity. That's a feature of mode of representing. They might be simple, they might be exact, and so on. All those things are features of the model, not of what it is a model of. And of course, those models are also kind of static. Wittgenstein compares this method of clarification to painting a stationary picture of a landscape. That picture is supposed to capture something characteristic of the landscape. Of course, the landscape is constantly changing. Wind comes, the light is different. That picture never maybe captures the landscape exactly as it is, but it is meant to capture something characteristic of that landscape. And that's the kind of, that's a comparison that Wittgenstein uses. That's the sort of thing that we do when we use these grammatical rules, for instance, or simple language games as models in order to clarify specific aspects of language use. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.